Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Beyond the Pain, Heart and Home Healing After Loss. I am super excited about today's episode because honestly, I feel like I'm going to learn a lot along with you in the next hour or so. This next guest is super knowledgeable in his field, and I've never actually picked his brain before. So I'm super excited. He is a trauma-informed certified coach, and his name is Mike Ayala-White.
Yeah,
Mike, thank you so much for being on here with me
yeah.
today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so there's so many things that I want to talk to you about today. So I apologize ahead of time if my brain is like ping ponging, but we'll just go with it.
Let's go. Let's do it.
Yeah. So first of all, a quick like, who are you? What do you do? What's your experience? Like, why are you a trauma informed certified coach? We'll start with
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Great question. A trauma-informed certified coach. So I work with men to help restore identity and find purpose, primarily through the road of addiction and trauma. A lot of guys have a lot of things going on, and most of the time, if not all of the time, there's some sort of either traumatic event or small traumatic events along the way that set them up for looking for something to get their needs met when they don't necessarily know that. And in comes addiction of shopping, pornography, sex, alcohol, drugs, like eating, gambling, pick your thing. That is helping them to meet the needs that they did not get met when they were younger. And that escalates into a full blown addiction as they get older. And that's directly birthed out of my own story of recovery from addiction and a lot of trauma in my own life. And so as I had to walk this road for myself personally, I found out that I was pretty good at helping guys to walk through their story and figure out where did they, like, what happened to them, how did they get to where they are, and then where do they want to go. And so I got into trauma informed coaching because it was a lot of my own experience personally as I went through clinical care, counseling, trauma therapy, all intensives, all of that type of stuff. And from there, it felt like a very natural jump to get into it in a professional sense. And so I've been doing that for a little while now, really enjoy it. I'm pretty decent at it, and I'm getting better pretty much every day.
Nice. Okay. Very cool. So,
Yeah.
okay, so you mentioned something, and I want to break this down. You mentioned that you help, men who maybe have had like, whether it's a traumatic event or small traumatic events leading up to, whatever that leads up to. So, is there a difference in how it plays out when you take like small traumatic events versus like a traumatic event? And I'm asking because I'm asking for my personal experience. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say I had a lot of small traumatic events in my childhood, like leading up to adulthood. I actually had a very easy childhood,
Mm-hmm.
but I definitely have had some traumatic events
Mm-hmm.
as an adult. So, like, what's the difference there? Like, do they play out this similarly, like as you get older and as you live your life, or are they two totally separate issues?
It's a great question. My personal opinion, having larger traumatic events when they're older doesn't make it easier necessarily. But when you're young, your brain is still really developing. And so, like the front part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex or your frontal lobe, it's where logic, reason, philosophy, intellectual assent, and consequences all live here. This doesn't develop in women till their mid 20s and men till their late 20s, early 30s, like fully.
Hmm.
But the mid part of your brain, your limbic, you pop out as a feeler. That's why you cry. That's why you laugh. That's why you are expressing the needs that you have as a child as soon as you come out of the womb. There's a guy named Kurt Thompson who's a doctor, and he studies interpersonal neurobiology, which is the study of relationships and how they affect the brain. And he says every single one of us comes into this world looking for someone, looking for us. Like that's why a
Hmm.
baby comes out crying right away because they're looking for their parent. This part of your brain as a child is not really there. That's why if any of you have children or nieces or nephews, you can't reason with a 4-year-old kid because they don't have the like, neurological ability. All they have is their feelings. So when the ice cream cone hits the ground, their world is over. And you're like, I'll just get you another one because your brain is fully developed and you know there is more ice cream out there. But to them, that's it. It's over. And I bring that up because when kids experience traumatic events, they don't know how to process that. They have no idea how to understand it's probably almost always not their fault. And yet they can carry this guilt and the shame around whatever has happened to them into their adult life. And that can formulate how they view and see the world, how they see relationships, how they see good and bad things happen to them. And that's on a subconscious level. A lot of times they don't even know that they have what are called core negative beliefs of, I'm a bad person because I was abused. And it's like, if a 4-year-old told you that, what would you think? You would think that, no, that's crazy. And yet we develop these core negative beliefs when we're young. When things happen to us when we're older, we have a much more fully formed brain, and it's a little bit easier to process than some of the traumatic events that happen when we're younger, because we just don't have the capability, the life experience, and probably the community to come around us, which is a huge deal of being able to process through trauma and experience healing, is doing that in community. Having men and women in your life that are able to handle extremely hard situations. And they don't have to fix it. They just have to be there with you in it, because a lot of times it can't be fixed. But there can be healing that can be experienced through good relationship. When you're younger, you don't know what you need. You don't have the neurological ability to express a lot of the deep needs, and also just be able to process the heaviness of life. So when you experience trauma when you're older, there's a better chance of it being repaired and healed if you have good community and if you have had a decent upbringing, because that means your brain is developing in a better way.
Okay. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so with all of that said, I probably should have asked this first, but with all of that said,
Yeah.
If you ask me, I've experienced some traumatic events,
Mm-hmm.
and I know a lot of my listeners have too.
Mm-hmm.
But like, what is trauma? What is a traumatic event? Like, what defines that? Because if you ask me, yeah, I've experienced a couple of traumatic events, but it's like, what is a traumatic event? It was scary, life-changing, earth-shattering, shocking. Like, what is a traumatic event? What is trauma?
Yeah. So there's two different questions in there. What is trauma and what is a traumatic event? Because they're not the same thing.
Okay.
The traumatic event is the experience you've gone through, whatever that may be. The trauma is what's left over. However that affects you moving forward on a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual level, that's the trauma. And so for a lot of us in early childhood and in adult life, we experience trauma or traumatic events, and it creates what's called a rupture in a relationship, whether that be through abuse, neglect, abandonment, as you get older, stillborn birth, like depending on what happens, all of that is the traumatic event. The trauma is the rupture that's left over, the longing for whatever it was taken. And how we process the trauma is we can't process that on our own. We need help. We're made for a relationship. We're made to be in a relationship. And then trauma shifts the dynamic of the relationships that we have into either some form of major rupture, which needs repair, or distance, because people don't know how to handle our stories anymore. The people that we grew up with, the people that were our friends, that were our family, they themselves don't know how to handle the heaviness of life. And so they do a couple different things. They either distance themselves, they say they're going to be available, but they're not. They say it's your fault, like, because they don't know how to process it. And then we're just kind of left like, again, there's the narrative that starts to spin, the shame narrative of like, what's wrong with me? The thoughts in the dark nights of like, what is so broken in me that all these people have left? Or I probably also started isolating, and they don't know how to handle that either, because I don't know how to process what I just went through. So the traumatic event is the experience. Trauma is what's left over. And one of the myths about trauma is that it's not stored in the body. Your body remembers everything that happens to it, whether you want it to or not. That is very, very clear now with the data. There's a very famous book out there called The Body Keeps a Score. And it's a phenomenal book just about how your mind can forget things, but your body doesn't. And it keeps the score of all the things that have happened to you, all the things that you have done, all the wrongs and rights that have happened to you. And your nervous system knows and remembers those things. That's why there are trauma responses sometimes that are just unexpected, that come up, because our nervous system is somehow reminded of something that's happened to us in the past, in our present, and it kicks on because it wants to protect us, And now all of a sudden we have severe anxiety, severe depression. We want to leave a situation. We don't know how to talk to people. All of these things are happening in an instant because of the traumatic event that happened, which left the imprint of trauma on our bodies, our minds, and our souls.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you explain that so perfect, because I don't know if I would ever be able to explain that to someone, but I know it because it happens to me so often. Like, so for example, after our daughter Layla died, the sound of a crying baby, like my heart would race.
Yeah.
I'm like, even if I'm fine, like my heart would race.
Yeah.
Or even just being around young children or seeing a mom pushing her baby in a stroller, like would just make my heart race. Like I would get anxious, and like I literally didn't know what to do with it. I'm just like, is this normal? Am I going to pass out? Like, and then another example is, after Rick was super sick, he was sick for, in total, way too many months until he got some serious help, ended up in the hospital, major surgery, the whole thing. But not even just in the hospital, before the hospital too, watching him day in and day out be sick, constantly sleeping, wasting away. And so then we went through the hospital experience and, the surgery, which if you asked me, you would think my baby dying would probably be more traumatic. But actually, Rick being in the hospital and being sick, if I had to like put a scale on it, would probably be more traumatic, because there was nothing like her birth and her death, like it was horrible, but it was also so beautiful. So when I look at it, there's like beautiful nuggets that I try to look for and hold on to. When Rick was sick and in the hospital, like there was nothing like good. Like the only, you know what I'm saying? Like he was sick, he was dying. There was no beautiful experience that came out of it. It was all pure, just bad things happening. Obviously good did come out of it, but and so now when I walk through those hospital doors, even when I feel like I'm walking in with complete confidence, like we were just there yesterday, Rick had a procedure done, and I walked in and I'm like, this is nothing compared to what we've done. My heart is racing. My body, or my eyes see the hospital, and it's like, something's going to happen, and it's like, and you can't describe it to someone other than it just feels like your body, your fight or flight just kicks in, your nervous system's going crazy, and you can't control it. It's such an odd feeling.
Yeah. That's what's called your ANS, your autonomic nervous system. And what your ANS does all the time, right now in this conversation, is it scans the room wherever you are for threats, for things that it thinks are threats. That's why when you're out to dinner or you're talking or something, and there's like a loud bang off to the side, your almost immediate response is to just look, because your nervous system is like, there's a threat over there, and I need to see that it's not a threat. So we turn and look, everything's okay, and we go back to the conversation. In a similar way, when you go to the hospital, your nervous system and your eyes are processing and seeing like, aha, I know what happens when we go here, and boom, your body's giving you more adrenaline, more cortisol, more whatever it needs to be more aware in that situation, because it's a real threat. And I just want to speak to one other thing you said, which I think is really important. There's a woman named Kathy Lorzell, and she works for a place called the Allender Center, which has with a guy named Dan Allender, and big influence on the way I see the world now. She developed what's called the U curve, or the U model, like the letter U, and it's based off of the Easter story of Friday is at the top of the U, crucifixion, Saturday's in the bottom and the middle of the U, and Sunday is resurrection and joy and surprise. She says what we do, particularly in the Christian realm, is we bypass, or we try to build a bridge from Friday to Sunday, and we skip over Saturday. But everything we need to enjoy Sunday is found in Saturday. Because in the original story, to what you just said, Mary just watched her son get brutally murdered and executed publicly. The disciples lost their leader, friend, and there is no hope. We skip straight to Sunday because we want the resurrection on this side of history. In that story, there is no hope. He is dead. It is gone. And that's their experience. And everything we need to enjoy the resurrection is found in the Saturday experience, because we learn how to grieve, we learn how to cry out to God, we learn how to question in healthy ways. And to your point, in the beginning of this hospital experience, it sounds like that is your Saturday. and there's no hope. Your brain's trying to tell you, like, believe, and your body's like, I don't care what you think right now. What I feel is there's no hope. This is not going to end well. And yet the resurrection, Sunday happens, there's surprise, there's joy, all of that. That's all great and dandy. But in order to enjoy Sunday, we have to go through our Saturday experience. What we do in the Christian perspective is we build a bridge right from Friday to Sunday, and what's called spiritual bypass, where we just skip over the pain. And we don't know why we can't handle when bad things happen. We don't know why when things are good and heavy, we can't hold it, because we don't have the framework. Everything we need for the resurrection is found in the Saturday experience of death. And so I just want to point that out, because for people listening, like, don't, and I say this with much compassion and also having to do it myself, where you find yourself in the bottom of the U of like, what the bleep is going on? Like, if you're real, where the bleep are you? I think there's a lot of honor in that. I think the Psalms are very clear about that too, of just crying out from the soul of like, what in the world? And I think that's where God wants to meet us, is in our pain and in that death experience. If something like that has happened to you, or even just emotionally of a loss of relationship, trauma, whatever, to bring you out, to transform you, to heal you, and to give you a framework for life that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And none of that feels good. And a lot of that's hard to see when you're in the middle of the Saturday experience, because there's no hope. And I would argue that's exactly where you're supposed to be if you're attaching yourself to God, because he will transform you. But boy, is that painful. So, yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't go off on a rabbit trail like that.
No, it was so good. I love that. I've never heard that analogy like that before. It's so good. And you're so right, because that is where the pain and the growth is. I literally just did a whole episode about, if you want to change, you want to become the best version of yourself, like, you got to go where the pain is, like, because that's where the growth is. And you can't skip over it. I didn't use that analogy, but that is basically what I just said. You cannot build a bridge from Friday to Sunday. You have to go through the Saturday. I love that so much. And that's touches on something I really wanted to talk about, which is avoiding the grief. I think I saw you put out I think a reel on Instagram or something, and you talked about avoiding grief, how people are so quick to avoid it. And so touching on that and kind of rewinding a little bit in my story, which is, you know, the times where I was crying out to God. And at the time, it just felt, it was the heaviest time of my life. But what I didn't realize is it was the first couple of steps of me really feeling the pain and not avoiding my grief. I was really good at not avoiding the grief. I didn't want to heal, and I didn't want to like do hard work at first, but I was definitely very good at feeling my grief and the pain and all of that, because part of the reason it was so hard for me was it wasn't just the loss that I suffered, it was the betrayal that I felt at the time from God. And the reason is because my story, you know, growing up, like I had mentioned, I had a very easy childhood. We took in lots of, kids when they were teenagers from, you know, rough homes, or just, or we just, our doors were just always open. Like, we always had people in our house. So much so, 3 of them moved in with us, like literally lived with us. And those are the people that I call my immediate family today. And so with that, you know, being some of my background, as we got older, you know, Rick and I, after we got married, we wanted to have our own kids. We wanted to bring in kids, which we did. And so it was just always a passion of mine to build this like big mixed family of my kids, you know, bringing in other kids or whatever. And so I was like, oh my gosh, like, I'm living out my dream life. Then when I got pregnant, it was we brought in the 3 kids. Then I got pregnant, and I was like, I'm doing it, you know, like I'm building the life I always wanted to build. I'm doing the thing that I always had in my heart to do. And I found a spouse who wants to do it with me. Like, this is incredible. And not only was the pregnancy an answer, like, or, you know, a part of the life I always wanted to build, but for years and years, like literally almost 6 years, we watched everybody else get pregnant, like literally everybody else get pregnant. And I had a lot of close, you know, friends and family members who knew how badly we wanted to get pregnant. So they were praying for us. They were along the ride, you know, the journey with us. And so when I got pregnant, like, it was a big deal. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't just like, hey, somebody else is pregnant. And it was like, like, it's finally her turn, you know, like that's how I felt. And that's how everybody else felt too, because they knew how long we wanted to do this. And the
Hmm.
reason I'm spending so much time explaining this is because when she died, it was like, what the bleep? Do you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just the loss. The loss was hard enough. The losing my daughter, like losing a full grown 39 and a half week cooked baby, just gone, that was hard enough. It was the betrayal and the immediate silence I felt from God when that baby left my arms that day. It was like speechless. Like when I found out that she died, like that is how I can describe the moment, was literally speechless. I had no words. I didn't know what to do. And so all of that to say, now I'm going on a rant, is I had so many deep, dark moments of just crying out to God, like, I don't even feel you near me right now. I'm screaming at the top of my lungs. I don't even know if you can hear me, but I'm going to scream anyways because I have to scream at someone, and it might as well be you because this is your fault. And, you know, these are all the things that I felt at the beginning.
Yeah.
And so from that point, you know, today to today is where all of that, I mean, and I'm scrunching this down into, you know, this small amount of time, but that it's been a while. It's been 2 years, you know, since those times. And there's been many, many steps of healing and growth in between there, baby steps. But that brings me to the thing I want to talk about is how people avoid that.
Hmm.
You know, they feel the anger and they want to just be angry. And they feel the sadness and they just want to be sad. And they avoid whatever, you know, gets you from here to here. And like you said, they just want to like build a bridge and they don't want to go through that. And I just want to, you know, hear you speak about that. Like, why are people looking to avoid it? And why is that dangerous? And the benefits of not avoiding it, like all of those things.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks so much for sharing your story publicly. I just want to acknowledge the work that we haven't seen, all the work that you have done for yourself, for your family, to show a legacy of entering into the pain, because it's very, very, very easy and it's very, very lonely to go down into the U and sit there and not have hope and go, I don't know when I'm coming out of, I don't know if I'm coming out of the other side of this thing. I have no idea. And that's part of the Saturday experience, is that, and I'll get to your question in a second, but I think what's important to understand is, like, for those who are listening to this that are Christians, like, Jesus died on Friday, and Friday night is Passover. Or I'm sorry, Friday night is the Sabbath. And so what's important to understand is that Mary's son is murdered somewhere around 3 p.m. and the Sabbath starts at sundown, whenever that is. She now has to go and prepare to not work on Saturday and worship God all night, Friday to Saturday night. And her whole world is blown up. And now she has to enter into this thing that's supposed to worship the very God who watched her son be murdered. To your point, like, screaming to the heavens, like, what the like, and I'm supposed to go prepare meals and sit and worship you all day? Like, are you kidding? Are you serious? And I think what's really important to understand is that God can handle that. God can handle those deep moments. He is not afraid of them. He wants them. Mm-hmm. We have been taught, consciously or subconsciously, typically in the church culture, that we have to have faith, and that God does not want to hear us complain. He doesn't want to hear our pain, and he certainly doesn't want to hear doubt. And it's like, well, the Psalms would say otherwise, so I'm going to trust what's in there when David is screaming at the top of his lungs in Psalm 42, why are you downcast, O my soul? And what's important about that, and I will get to the question, but I think this is important, is when you look at the Hebrew for the word downcast, it's actually like, it means bent or prostrated. And what they're talking about is the fetal position. Utterly helpless and broken by pain. When he says, why are you bent? Like asking God, why did you bend my soul? Like physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, just agony.
Yeah.
And yet he's handing that over to God, going like, you did this, so you got to fix it. And that's part of getting out of the you. is we don't know when the transformation happens. We don't have a ton of participation. We have participation getting down in there, which we'll talk about. But the transformation part is up to God. That Saturday experience is different for everybody. For some people, it may be a very quick thing and they're out. For some of us, like myself, it was a multi-year thing where you're just sitting down there like, I can't see the light, and I guess this is my lot. And God transforms that. So to your actual question, why do people avoid it? Number one, because it's easy. Number two, because their nervous systems are telling them, don't you dare go down there, which is very important to understand. Our nervous systems are built and designed to protect us. And what happens is trauma hijacks the very things that are meant to make us safe. And those things actually imprison us in the very places we don't want to be. And so we actually have to work and cooperate and almost challenge lovingly and slowly our nervous systems to be able to slowly enter down into the U. Because we don't need to cliff jump down into the U. It's not wise. All sorts of weird things are going to happen to you with your nervous system of nausea, vomiting, like passing out, because it's just like, we cannot handle this. That's fine. You're walking downstairs into the U. And so we don't want to do it. Our nervous systems are telling us don't do it. We grew up in a culture, particularly in the West, like where we live. We have entire fields of entertainment, of medication, and culture that teach us avoid grief at all costs. Don't age, don't die, don't talk about death. You go over in Eastern culture to Africa and Asia and India. It's very different. They embrace death as a pathway to somewhere else. And so it's part of life. Everything that we have been taught is that life is about you. And it's not about how it ends. It's about how you're supposed to fake it until you die. And that affects the way we see the world. That's why death is so jarring over here, because we do everything we can to avoid it. And with death comes grief, with loss comes grief. And we're not supposed to lose and we're not supposed to die. So we just avoid it. That's why it is so jarring, and there are so many weird responses to people when they're in grief because they don't know how to, quote, do it. But one of the things that I realized through doing this work is that you actually do know how to grieve. You just forgot. Your nervous system does know how to cry. It does know how to wail when you're a child. All of that stuff is kind of suppressed or pushed out of you, either in church culture or in American culture. And so when you tap back into it, it's so foreign, it's so uncomfortable, and it feels so lonely. But over in the East, they have communal grieving. You read it in scripture where they had professional wailers that would wail for 7 days. Like, all of that existed, and we just removed all of it in our culture. We just built the bridge from Friday to Sunday. And so it's a multi-layered question, and it's a multi-layered answer. But for those of you who are finding yourself in a season, two things. Number one, be gentle with yourself. You probably don't want to do it, and I understand why you don't. It is very necessary. The benefits of it are wide and vast. Number one, I am far more myself, like who God made me to be, because I grieved the losses that have happened to me and the losses that I am responsible for. Number two, I am far more comfortable in my own body. My body is not an adversary anymore. Trauma makes our body an adversary because we don't understand why we're responding when we walk into a hospital and our heart races, our blood pressure shoots up, we start to sweat a little bit. Like, all of those are trauma responses. Grief can help your body heal. And number three, there's a good chance that if you grieve well, you're going to meet people along the way that you never thought you would. And it's going to open these weird doors that you don't see, and you can't see them because when you're down in the Saturday part of the story, there's no hope. And as you're coming out, you start to see these people and meet these people who are like, you too? That happened. I thought I was the only one. Like, and all of a sudden you're not alone anymore. And now you can bond with these people. And then number four, you're going to have a story that you never thought you'd have. And as we talk about it, I just want to read a quote from a podcast I was listening to. It says, by harming, and it's talking about a lot of this, it says, by harming you, evil unwittingly prepared you to rule your kingdom better than had you not been harmed. And it's the redemption of the brokenness that has happened to us. And when he says rule your kingdom, he's talking about the influence that God is giving you through your story. So there's a lot of benefits to grieving, a lot of benefits to grieving well. And I just want to acknowledge how hard it is, because it is not easy. And I've had to do it multiple times, and it is painful, but it will transform you. It is the path to transformation.
Yeah. So good. So one thing you said, and I just want to highlight that because I think my audience is, I have a lot of people that follow me that are newly grieving, and a lot of people that follow me are newly grieving a baby or a child.
Mm-hmm.
And so something you said, I want to highlight it for those people that are listening. And my grief coach is the first person to say this to me, and I totally back her up on this, that there is a season of life for simply just grieving.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're like early on, you know, in loss, you don't have to be, you don't have to work. You don't have to, you know, be working to get better. Like in the beginning, like there is something very important about simply just grieving.
Yeah.
And not trying to get better.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the beginning, you know, like, and I just want to highlight that because I don't want everybody to think like, oh, I just found out my baby died, or I just found out my mom died 24 hours ago. You better start, you know, like, I think there's a little bit of like a, come on, you pick yourself up. Like, no, you allow yourself to be, because the way that you know, best helped me get through those times was, you know, you're given this small amount of energy after a giant blow, after life, you know, knocks the wind out of you, whether it's loss, trauma, whatever it is, any sort of, you know, profound event. You have like almost no energy, and so you have to be super careful and super specific about where you put it. And so at first there is something really important and beautiful and special about just grieving. And so I just wanted to mention that because I know I have a lot of people who are, you know, pretty early on. And I also want to just mention about something that you have said, that you just said that nobody else has said. And I'm like, I literally have it on my list of podcast topics that I want to talk about, because I know it hits me like a ton of bricks all the time. And I just want to talk about it for a minute.
Yeah.
Basically what you said is, you know, sometimes after these traumatic events or these losses or whatever, you wake up after you've done the hard work. I mean, it's a lifelong journey. I'm not saying, oh, I've arrived, I'm done. Yeah. But after, for, you know, a couple years or however long it's been, you've done the hard work, you're becoming the best version of yourself, the best version that you know that God created you to be. But it's only because you suffered the loss that you did, or it's only because you went through that traumatic. And that like rocks me, because I'm like, it makes me question, like, was I never going to get to this point if I didn't suffer? Does that mean other people are never going to reach their full potential unless they suffer, you know? And that sends me into a spiral, and I'm like, you know, it almost makes me like nervous. I'm like, am I thankful that it happened to me? Because there's nothing, you're never going to convince me like that my daughter was meant to die. You're never going to convince me that like this was a part of God's plan. Like if that's how God operates, like I'm not interested. And I truly don't believe that it is how he operates. So it's just that concept of knowing that quote, I'm going to butcher it. I'm not even going to try to repeat what you just said, but basically what that quote was, and what racks my brain all the time is like, a lot of these times, like we had to go through the fire to become that refined version of ourselves that we so desperately wanted to be, but it's literally only because we went through that. And it rattles my brain.
Yeah. I mean, it's a man, it's tough. You know, it's tough to try to pin down, and like, cause you're wrestling it out and you're like, how does this actually work? And, you know, the book of Job is a great example of that, where, you know, back then in the New Testament and now, like the concept of belief was like, if you do good things will happen to you. And if bad things happen to you, it's because you've done bad things. And I think it's John chapter 9 as well, where there's a man who was born blind, and the disciples were like, who sinned, this guy or his parents? And that's the belief of like, somebody must have done something. And Jesus is like, that's not right. Like, there's other things going on here that you don't understand. It's a question. I mean, I still wrestle with it sometimes, of like, you know, would I trade what happened to me and the path I had to take? No. Would I trade on my side of the street, would I trade some of the carnage that I've caused? Absolutely. And even in some of that, I had to learn certain things that came with some of that carnage. And it's a tough thing to wrestle out because you're trying to hold eternity in your hands, and it's like sand, and you're like, I can feel some of it, but it slips through my fingers, and it's just kind of like, man. And so, it's like Romans 8:28, and this is one that people use all the time to bypass, and it drives me nuts now because I used to do it when they're like, all things work together for the good of God, those who love God and are called according to His purpose. And it's like, okay, well, that's like an end statement after you just unpacked how hard and difficult the road is, but you're leading with it as a bypass because you don't want to go down into the pain.
Yeah.
And that's part of the issue in some of the Western Christian culture is we use these verses to just bypass the pain. And I'm like, dude, like the very thing that you want is found in the very place you just don't want to go. You want all these things over here, but you're not willing to go down into the you. And I don't know what to tell you. I think of one specific client that I work with who, it's a unique situation. She experienced a lot of betrayal, in like relational betrayal. And when we first started, I remember being like, I just want to heal and get this done. And it was like fresh, to your point. And I was like gently like, hey, like, you just need to sit here for a little bit. Like, I know you don't want to like pitch a tent here, but if you're asking me what I think, like, you're just going to have to hang out here for a while because the work that needs to be done can't really be done until you get the layout of the land. You need to know where you are. You need to know the layout. And that only comes with time. And sometimes we want to just get in, get out. That's not how it works. We have to participate in going in. And I would argue some of the most difficult things of the transformation process are we don't have full control over how that happens. We don't know when we're going to come out the other side of the U. We can't see up there, and that's God carrying us out. We have to walk with Him in, and He carries us out. But that's not on our timeline. That's on His timeline. We participate in the process, we do the work, but that doesn't mean that we can just shoot out whenever we want. So for those entering in, I would totally agree. Like, you just got to sit there and just be. Our culture tells us all the things we have to do. And God's far more concerned about who we are becoming and who we are than what we do. He can do whatever He wants. He got no problem with that. It's more about cooperating with Him to become who He wants us to be. And then as far as the transformation process goes, it's a hard thing to wrestle down. And it's one of those things where, like, it's a saying that I got from a buddy of mine of what's called between the cherubs, of like the things that I can't understand are just between the angels and God, and I just don't know, like how it all works itself out. And I think that's okay. Like, life is more mysterious now in this season for me, and I've become far more secure in that, going like, yeah, I'm not sure. And if He wants to tell me, great, I'm all ears. But what I used to believe, I had everything figured out, and then life punched me right in the soul, and I was like, I don't know a thing. So, yeah, transformation process is tricky, and it's okay that it's tricky, and it's okay to wrestle with that, because I think God will help us see redemption in a deeper way when we engage the brokenness.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that was really well said. I have one more thing that I want to talk about, and it's kind of off topic what we've been talking about, but it's very relevant to a lot of the things that I talk about on my channel. So I don't know if you talk about this a lot, but you did talk about it in one of your videos that you put out there. And so, and you talked about how your internal chaos is linked to your external chaos. And the way that is relevant to a majority of my audience is, I talk a lot about how, because the first thing that I did when after my loss was I started doing all kinds of stuff in my external world, specifically my house. Yeah. I started doing DIY projects. I decluttered. I was cleaning like a maniac. Like, I was like, if life can just, I didn't say this, but what my body was doing, it was saying basically, if anything can just happen whenever, whatever, whenever, I'm going to control all the things that I control. And so I was just like, boom, boom, like getting rid of stuff and cleaning this, and everything like had to be perfect. And at the time, it was my way of coping, as my grief coach calls it. I thought I was like, I'm healing. Look at me go. I'm doing good. I'm getting up every day and I'm doing these projects. Like, look at me go. And that's how I gained a big portion of my following on Instagram. Is I started getting all these followers watching me like flip my house, clean my stove, and like all these things. And I was like, look at me go, like I'm healing. I'm doing great things after this traumatic loss. Then all of that adrenaline started, wearing off. And I was left with my internal chaos still. And I hadn't even touched the surface of my internal chaos. Now, at this point, I tell my audience all the time, it's important to get your external world under control, but it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
They're two separate worlds, like you said, internal versus external. And so from my experience, the first step to getting my internal world under control was controlling my external world, because it finally gave me the space and the room to breathe. I literally literally got rid of 70% of all of the items I owned. I cleared out my schedule. I, cleared out people that were, I don't want to say wasting my time. That sounds terrible, but just that weren't an important part of the part of the process that I was in at that time.
Yeah.
And I cleared my space and to in turn clear my mind. And that gave me the space to start working internally.
Yeah.
And so that's what worked for me. And so, but I think it's very important that people realize that connection that you were talking about, and how they're two separate things, but they're very much linked, if that makes sense. And so I was just hoping to, get your opinion on how that all works.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a great observation. And even for the way you described it, it sounds like please correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like there may not even have been space to deal with the internal world if the external world wasn't cleared out to give you the space to do that.
Exactly. That's how I felt. Like, I mean, part of my personality is I just like order. So my house is always, before all this, was always like picked up and tidied and things like that. But it was that like you just said, I can't even think straight. I can't even process what just happened if I don't put my hand to something physical first to completely clear out anything that's like lingering on my to-do list. Like, I can't touch this before I touch all that, it's kind of like that. That's at least how it worked for me.
Yeah. And something else you said that was very powerful, a very powerful observation in having self-awareness was, it's not uncommon during the grief process to be reaching for control in whatever way that works for the person. For you, it was order and cleaning, because grief shows us how very little we are in control, and loss shows us how very little, and how paradoxically beautiful and strong humans are, and how frail life can be outside of our control at the exact same time. And that's one of those things where, like, two things can be true at the same time that feel paradoxical, which is, I think, how God operates a lot, actually, is that way, where he puts us, I shouldn't say puts us, the way that life is ordered is it stretches our minds and our hearts to have to wrestle with the eternal things that fit together, but in the finite are paradoxical, where you're like, both of these things are true, but I don't know how they can both be true at the same time. And I think that's a lot of how God works sometimes. The internal world, we have to be careful where the internal world can be so painful, particularly when you don't have, like, if you've never gone down through the Saturday experience before, and it's that first time, there's such a pull, like we talked about before, to avoid it and just simply focus on the external world. And it's not wrong to like you said, to clean and to make sure that you have the space to do that, but you have to enter into that internal world and go down the you, as we were talking about, because if you don't, all sorts of weird things start happening in your body. Like, externally, everything can look fine, but if you're always in a mode of fight or flight because of the grief or the loss, the amount of cortisol levels that are being produced and sent into your organs, like, you're wearing your body out. And everything can look fine on the outside, but internally your body's like, we cannot handle this amount of stress forever. Something will give. And that can manifest itself in hypertension, high blood pressure, like all these weird things that we think like, well, I'm just getting older. And that's part of it. Or maybe your body is just so worn out because you haven't dealt with the internal chaos. And that's also how addiction starts, is something happens, you don't know how to deal with it. And so if we're high anxiety, big fight or flight response, like alcoholism is a downer and it brings you down. It brings the stress down in your body. So when we're dealing with the external chaos, I think there's two things. Number one, why am I dealing with the external chaos? And number two, is my external chaos actually linked to my internal chaos? In the way of, if my internal chaos would calm down, my external chaos would calm down. Maybe it's not about clutter with stuff. Maybe it's about relational chaos externally, because your internal world is just churning all the time. Doesn't mean that they're not responsible for their actions, the other person. They absolutely are. But when your nervous system is on 10 all the time, and they say something that maybe, had you been dealing with the internal chaos, would be a joke, but you just snap. And they're like, what? Like, whoa, like, this situation calls for like a level 4 response, and you're at 10 all the time. So those people don't know how to interact with you because your internal chaos is just churning all the time. And inevitably, it will create some form of external chaos, typically relationally, because it'll be the other person's fault all the time instead of just sometimes. You start to isolate because you don't want to be around people. This happened to me where I'm a very extroverted person, and for a good 2 years, I was an introvert. And I remember talking to my trauma therapist, like, hey man, I don't know if I'm now just an introvert or if I just hate people in the season, like what it is. And as I continued to heal, I became much more who I was as a child, which was just like a happy-go-lucky type of guy who loves people. And that's who I am now. But that's because the internal chaos has calmed down significantly. It's not over. It's never over. But my external world is matching my internal world now. So that's really something for like the people listening, is like, hey, if my internal world and external world match in dysfunction, that's something to go, hey, I need to pay attention to this, because something's going on in here that I'm playing a part in, not fully responsible, but playing a part in. If my external world and my internal world don't match, and my external world looks great and my internal world doesn't, that's also something to know, because now you're image projecting what you want people to see. But if your internal world and your external world match relatively well in terms of calmness and people and things like that, that's a pretty good sign.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a really good point to point out that it's not just about having them both perfect. It's about making sure that they match. Mm-hmm. Because like you said, if they're both chaotic, the external world can kind of be like a marker.
Yeah.
Like if my external world is crazy and chaotic, like it's probably time to like look inward and go, okay, what's going on inside? Why is everything out here so chaotic? It's probably because everything in here is so chaotic. But then there's also the flip side of that, which I haven't talked about a lot, and that's super important too, which is if everything out here is perfect, but everything in here is not, that's also a sign of, okay, it doesn't stop there. Like now we're just faking it.
Yeah.
And that's also super dangerous, and that's also because out here, I do think it's important, but but certainly not as important as what's going on in here. And I think people can work both ways. I think some people go, I need to start out here so I can clear my space and work in here. That was me.
Yeah.
Other people go, I don't care about that. I got to get to work here. And then once they do get to work in here, everything else out there probably becomes, I would imagine, a lot easier.
Yeah.
because they have gotten control of what's going on inside of them.
Yes. And there's one other thing I do want to say is, I think this is also very important is, as you come out of the you, you're different and you're transformed and continuously being transformed. And what can happen is, and I think this is very natural. I have a friend of mine who I know that this is happening to her. This has happened to me. Like, you're different and your world becomes different, and that can take some reorienting. So you have the process of like orientation of life as you knew it until the Friday event happens. And then you enter down into Saturday, which is disorientation. You're like, I don't know what the heck is going on. Craziness, just no hope. Sunday is reorientation. It's a total shift in the way that you see the world, the way that the world sees you, and the way you interact with it. That can feel overwhelming, and that can cause a different type of chaos. Not a bad chaos, but it's a reorienting of like, okay, now I got to figure out, I've been brought to a new land, and the grass feels different. Like C.S. Lewis talked about this in The Great Divorce, where people got off the bus in heaven, and they didn't like it because their feet weren't used to the landscape. And so they got back on the bus and left because they were like, this is too uncomfortable. But for those that stuck it out and learned how to live, it was transformational. I think it's very similar in that, where if you have done the work to the internal work, and there is internal chaos, might be too strong a word, but like internal tension with some external chaos, and you've come out the other side of like the Sunday experience, I think that's just reorienting. It's like, hey, it's not going to be like this forever. And maybe it's actually good because it means that I'm in a different space, in a different place, in a different mindset. I'm different. I'm around different people. All of that newness can be a lot for the nervous system to go, hey, this is all new and it's all good, but I'm not used to any of it. And that's okay, because it won't be like that forever. But it can be a lot. Like the Friday and Saturday experience are a lot in a different way. The Sunday experience can be a lot in a new and scary way because it's all new landscape and all of that. And that's good. That can just be a lot to overwhelm the nervous system and be like, I just need to breathe for a second. Like, it's all good. I'm just not used to it. So I want to honor that experience too, because I don't want it to just sound like, well, if your internal world calms down, your external world will be fine. It's like, there's a link there. But there's also the newness of walking in new life that is just foreign, that can take some time to get used to, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that, because that's also a really good point. They're different. They're two different types of, like you said, chaos sounds a little strong, but because new things can give you that like, unsettling, quote unquote, kind of feeling, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or chaotic or, it's just, it's new and it's different. And you're certainly going to experience a lot of those new and different feelings if you're working on your, your growth and your healing. So, okay, well, we're almost out of time, but before we are, I want to just give you an opportunity to share with my listeners just how they can find you or connect with you, whether it's social media, an email address, anything that you want to put out there so that they can connect with you.
Yeah. So my business is called Wayward Coaching. It's called Wayward Coaching because I was a wayward soul off the path and had to learn how to find my way back and work with guys to try to figure that out. So website is www.wayward-coaching.com. You can email me at mike@wayward-coaching.com. Social media, just look up Wayward Coaching. That's where all the business stuff is. And then I think my personal account's linked there too. I'll post it on both normally. I've been a little quiet on social media because I've been working on launching an online platform, like a community, through an app called Skool, Skool, to be able to better work with and build community for guys and people that are walking through, in my field, addiction and trauma. And there's always grief involved in that. Wherever there's addiction, there's probably a lack of grief because the addiction is filling the hole to make sure that they don't have to grieve. So, for anybody interested, like wayward-coaching.com or wayward-coaching.com, Mike@wayward-coaching.com, and then social media is always a good one too.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much for being on this episode. I feel like we talked about so many amazing things, and I'm really excited for my listeners to hear it all. So thank you, everyone, so much for listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, a positive review is always much appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to be alerted for new episodes. I can't wait to chat with you again really soon. Signing off for now, your hope dealer, Emmy Smith.